In the heart of the British monarchy, where silence is often more powerful than speech, a storm has been brewing for years. It began as a whisper within palace walls, the kind of uneasy murmur that staff pretend not to hear but can feel in every hallway. Now that whisper has erupted into a roar, echoing through the marble corridors of Buckingham Palace and beyond. King Charles, a man defined by restraint and duty, has finally spoken not through interviews or official statements, but through action. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And his message is one that reverberates with unmistakable finality. Prince Harry is no longer a prince, not in title, not in privilege, and not in standing. This is not just a family feud anymore. It's an act of royal excommunication cloaked in protocol and sealed with heartbreak. The story begins with tension that has been building for over 4 years, since the moment Harry and Meghan decided to step away from royal duties. At the time, it seemed like a bold but personal decision, the kind a modern couple might make in pursuit of peace and independence. But to the monarchy, a centuries-old institution built on loyalty, hierarchy, and image, it was seen as an act of rebellion. Still, even then, Charles hesitated to sever the bond. As both a father and a future king, he walked a line between empathy and expectation. He believed, perhaps naively, that time and distance might heal the wounds. But as the months passed, the rift only widened. The interviews grew sharper, the accusations more personal, and the silence from the palace more telling. The idea of reconciliation slowly slipped away, replaced by a weary acceptance that some divides can no longer be bridged. In recent weeks, the tension has reportedly reached its breaking point. According to insiders close to the palace, King Charles has made a decision that leaves no room for misinterpretation. He has ordered the final removal of Prince Harry's remaining royal privileges, those faint traces of connection that once tethered him to the family legacy. This includes the loss of symbolic titles, ceremonial patronages, and even certain family communications traditionally maintained for senior royals. The move is not merely administrative. It is deeply symbolic. It is the royal equivalent of closing the gates and drawing the curtains, signaling that Harry now stands outside the circle of royal life. For the king, this was not a decision made lightly. It was the culmination of years of frustration, disappointment, and, perhaps most painfully, disillusionment. But what exactly pushed Charles to this point? Many believe it wasn't one single incident, but a culmination of repeated acts that the king perceived as betrayal. The release of Harry's memoir, the televised interviews, and the continued portrayal of the royal family as cold, uncaring, and outdated reportedly struck at the very foundation of the monarchy's image. To Charles, who spent decades rebuilding public trust after the scandals of the 1990s, every headline that painted the monarchy in chaos felt like a step backward. Yet even so, he maintained a father's patience, until now. Sources suggest that a recent private communication between the two men turned confrontational, leading Charles to deliver the line that now defines the saga: "You're not a prince." Not as an insult, but as a declaration of fact. A recognition that Harry, by his own choices, has stepped beyond the institution that once defined him. For the public, the news has landed with both shock and inevitability. Those who have followed the royal family's saga saw this moment coming, even if they hoped it wouldn't arrive. For months, signs were visible. Charles's quiet omission of Harry and Meghan from key royal events. The decision to remove their names from official palace communications. Even the subtle body language at public gatherings hinted at a separation deeper than geography. Royal watchers noted that Harry's seat at the coronation was distant, not just physically but emotionally. Every image told the same story. Two lives, once intertwined by duty and affection, now running in parallel but separate paths. At its core, this isn't just a story about power, titles, or tradition. It's about a father and a son who no longer recognize each other. Charles, the boy who grew into a man under the crushing expectations of the crown, now faces a son who rejected those very expectations. Their conflict represents something larger, a generational collision between monarchy and modernity, between obligation and freedom. Harry's journey away from royal life was, in his mind, an act of liberation. He wanted to protect his family, his wife, and his sanity. But to Charles, that act has always felt like abandonment, a rejection not just of duty but of identity. And now, by severing the last ties, Charles is asserting what he believes to be necessary for the preservation of the monarchy, even if it means sacrificing the bond with his son. Behind palace walls, this decision has reportedly stirred mixed emotions. Senior aides have described the king as resolute but heavy-hearted. He is said to have confided to close friends that a monarch must think of the crown before the heart. It is a sentiment steeped in centuries of royal doctrine, the idea that personal feelings must yield to the weight of history. Yet, to those who know him, this was not a cold or calculated move. Charles is known for his sensitivity, for his desire to be understood rather than feared. Those close to him describe him as a man torn between two versions of himself. The empathetic father who once comforted a grieving boy at Diana's funeral, and the sovereign who now must guard the institution she once challenged. The irony is painful. The same system that caused Charles so much personal anguish as a young man has now forced him to impose that same pain on his own child. Meanwhile, in Montecito, Harry's reaction remains a mystery. Publicly, there has been no official statement, but those within his circle suggest he is both hurt and unsurprised. He has long anticipated this day, knowing that every step away from royal life brought him closer to total separation. Yet, knowing something is inevitable doesn't make it easier when it arrives. For Harry, this may feel like the final erasure of the life he once knew, the childhood he spent in palace corridors, the titles that once defined his role, the heritage that linked him to 1,000 years of royal history. Stripped of all that, what remains is simply a man, a husband, a father, perhaps freer than ever, yet profoundly alone. The public's fascination with this rift is understandable. It's not every day that a king disowns a prince. In the public eye, the royal family has always been a blend of fairy tale and tragedy, duty and dysfunction. Every generation faces its crisis. Abdications, divorces, scandals, and each time, the monarchy adapts and endures. But this feels different. This is not a scandal born of personal misconduct or political misstep. It is a fracture born of ideology, of two different visions for what it means to live under the weight of a crown. Harry represents the voice of individuality, emotion, and change. Charles embodies tradition, continuity, and restraint. In another world, these forces might have coexisted. But in the monarchy, where identity and image are inseparable, such differences can only collide. Observers are already calling this the most defining moment of King Charles's reign so far. The Queen's passing left him with a delicate balance to maintain, honoring tradition while modernizing the crown. In many ways, Harry's defiance threatened that balance. Every interview, every memoir, every public comment drew attention away from Charles's efforts to project stability. The king's advisors reportedly warned him that continued leniency toward Harry was seen by some within the establishment as weakness. Cutting ties, therefore, was as much a political act as a personal one, a message not only to his son but to the world, that the monarchy would not bend under emotional strain. It was Charles's way of drawing a line in the sand, declaring that being royal is not a right but a role, and one that demands absolute loyalty. And yet, beneath the formality of this decision lies something deeply human. Strip away the palaces, the titles, the cameras, and you are left with a father who once cradled his son, watched him grow, and hoped to see him carry the family legacy forward. For all the grandeur of monarchy, its pain is profoundly ordinary. Every family knows the sting of words spoken in anger, the silence that follows unresolved conflict. The difference here is that this family's wounds are public, dissected by millions. When Charles said, "You're not a prince," it was more than an official demotion. It was the sound of a father's patience collapsing under years of unhealed pain. The question now is what comes next. Will this final break mark the end of their relationship forever? Or will time, as it often does, soften the edges of resentment? Some royal insiders whisper that Charles's decision was as much an act of desperation as discipline. a last attempt to protect the crown while hoping Harry might one day understand the reasoning behind it. Others argue it is irreversible, that too many words and wounds have been exchanged. Whatever the truth, the world watches as a father and son stand on opposite sides of history. One holding a crown, the other holding on to conviction. The introduction to this story is not merely about loss or power. It's about identity. Who decides who is royal and who chooses to stop being one? In the coming sections, we will uncover the deeper layers behind this unprecedented royal decision. What led to it, who influenced it, and what it reveals about the monarchy's future in an era where tradition and independence are locked in constant battle. Because behind the public statements and official announcements, there is a private war unfolding, one that could redefine not only the House of Windsor but the very idea of royalty itself. In every family, there comes a moment when unspoken tensions finally demand words, when years of suppressed frustration erupt into action. For King Charles, that moment arrived quietly, without ceremony or announcement, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 royal decrees. The final straw, insiders say, did not come from a single betrayal, but from an accumulation of small, deliberate choices by Prince Harry, each one pulling him further away from the institution that raised him. It was a slow unraveling that had long been visible to anyone paying attention. To Charles, it wasn't just about a son rejecting tradition. It was about a prince dismantling the very foundation of monarchy in the public eye. It began with another seemingly harmless interview. Harry, sitting across from a familiar American host, his tone measured but unmistakably critical, once again revisited old wounds, his upbringing, his trauma, his grievances with the royal establishment. To the public, it was compelling television. To Charles, it was another knife twisted into the fragile fabric of the royal image he had spent decades repairing. Palace staff say the king watched the broadcast in silence, his expression unreadable. But when the interview ended, he reportedly stood up and left the room without a word. Those close to him say that silence spoke louder than anger ever could. The monarchy had always survived scandal, but this felt different. It was coming from within, from the one person he had hoped would protect the family's dignity. Harry's memoir had already been the first major blow. The pages dripped with raw emotion, painting vivid scenes of resentment, pain, and betrayal. He wrote about feeling overshadowed, neglected, and misunderstood. A young man growing up in the shadow of an institution that prioritized image over emotion. Yet for all its honesty, the memoir came at a devastating cost. Every revelation reopened old wounds for a father still learning to carry the crown. Charles had endured decades of public scrutiny, but to see his son reduce those memories into chapters of bitterness cut deeper than any tabloid headline ever could. For the monarchy, privacy is sacred. To Charles, it felt as though Harry had sold not just his own story, but the family's shared past. The king's advisors, who had been urging a firm response for months, saw the memoir and interviews as the point of no return. They argued that Harry's continued outbursts undermined the dignity of the crown and created an impression of weakness. Some senior courtiers reportedly told the king, "Your Majesty, as long as His Royal Highness remains attached to the institution, his actions reflect upon you." It was a blunt truth. Every time Harry's name appeared in a headline, the word prince followed. And every time that word appeared next to criticism of the monarchy, it eroded the prestige of the title itself. The idea that a man could abandon royal duty yet still enjoy its privileges became, in the eyes of many, intolerable. And for a king who ascended the throne promising modernization and stability, tolerance was beginning to look like indecision. Still, Charles hesitated. Despite everything, a part of him hoped for peace. But those who know him best say that it was not anger that finally changed his mind, it was exhaustion. The king, known for his long patience and his desire for reconciliation, had grown tired of watching the same narrative replay in the media. Every olive branch seemed to be followed by another public criticism. Every attempt at reconciliation ended in renewed distance. He realized that silence was no longer neutrality, it was complicity. And so, with the counsel of his most trusted aides, Charles made the decision to sever what remained of his son's royal identity. This decision reportedly came after a private meeting at Clarence's house. Sources claim that the discussion centered on institutional integrity. The question was not whether Charles still loved his son. He did. But whether he could continue to allow Harry's behavior to damage the monarchy's image. One senior official described the meeting as painfully decisive. After hours of debate, the king stood, looked out through the window overlooking the gardens, and simply said, "Enough." Those who were present described it as the moment the father gave way to the sovereign. The conversation ended not with shouting, but with quiet understanding. The monarchy could not afford to carry a rebel within its lineage. Within days, preparations began for what palace insiders called the final adjustment. Communications were reviewed, ceremonial roles reassigned, and titles quietly withdrawn from internal documents. Though the process was bureaucratic, its emotional impact was seismic. The few remaining privileges that symbolically connected Harry to the royal establishment, honorary military associations, invitations to official events, and ceremonial patronages, were removed or reassigned. It was not an announcement meant for the press, but the world noticed anyway. Royal watchers quickly pieced together the clues. Harry's name was missing from an updated royal website listing. Invitations for upcoming commemorations did not include him. Even small details, like official letters omitting his HRH title, confirmed what many had suspected. The king had drawn a line. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. For decades, Harry had represented the people's prince, the one who laughed freely, spoke candidly, and seemed most in touch with ordinary life. To see that image stripped away by his own father carried an almost Shakespearean weight. But to understand the king's perspective, one must look beyond the headlines. Charles's reign began under immense pressure, to prove himself worthy after decades as heir, to lead with compassion in an era that questions the relevance of monarchy itself. Every scandal threatened not only his credibility but the institution's survival. When Harry's actions became a global spectacle, Charles faced a choice between compassion and preservation. And for a monarch, preservation always wins. Behind the scenes, the Queen Consort, Camilla, is said to have supported the decision. While she has rarely spoken publicly about family tensions, those close to her describe her as fiercely protective of the king's emotional well-being. To her, the endless cycle of media attacks had become intolerable. She reportedly reminded Charles that a monarch's primary duty is to the crown, not to personal reconciliation. This reminder, though practical, struck the king deeply. For Charles, the hardest part of leadership has always been balancing heart and heritage. Yet the reality of monarchy leaves little room for sentimentality. Every gesture is political. Every silence is interpreted. By allowing the situation with Harry to linger, Charles risked appearing indecisive, a dangerous image for a king still securing his place on the throne. The final straw was not only the interviews or the memoirs but the cumulative realization that Harry no longer recognized the boundaries of royal identity. In one recent event, his public remarks about toxic hierarchies within the royal family were reportedly the breaking point. To the king, it was no longer about freedom of speech, it was about responsibility. The monarchy, for all its flaws, depends on an unwritten code of loyalty. That code may seem outdated to outsiders, but within palace walls, it is the glue that holds everything together. When a royal breaks that code, especially publicly, the damage is not easily repaired. Charles had once been the rebellious son himself, clashing with his parents over love and tradition. But the difference, as he sees it, is that he never sought to destroy the institution that constrained him. Harry's words, however unintentionally, had done just that. The meeting that followed between father and son, according to insiders, was tense but subdued. Harry was informed of the changes directly, not through aides. The king reportedly spoke with quiet authority, his tone controlled but unyielding. The conversation lasted less than half an hour. Harry, sources claim, responded calmly but left visibly emotional. There were no raised voices, no threats, just the hollow finality of two men realizing that the distance between them was now official. As one insider described, it was not a battle, it was a surrender. Charles had surrendered to duty. Harry had surrendered to consequence. When the news reached the public, reactions were divided. Supporters of the monarchy applauded the king's firmness, calling it necessary to protect the institution. Others viewed it as a tragedy, a father choosing the crown over his son. But within the palace, there was a sense of grim relief. Advisors described it as a weight lifted, a closure long overdue. The monarchy could now move forward without the constant uncertainty surrounding Harry's role. The message was clear. You cannot live outside the royal system while continuing to claim its authority. To Charles, this was not punishment but clarity. The fallout for Harry, however, is expected to be long-lasting. Without official royal ties, his identity as Prince Harry becomes more symbolic than legal. He remains a son of the king, but in every public and institutional sense, he now stands as a private citizen. This chapter of the royal story reflects something deeper than scandal. It reflects a philosophical divide. Harry's version of modernity sees transparency as truth, while Charles's version of monarchy sees silence as strength. Both men are in their own way, right? But both cannot coexist within the same system. The monarchy's endurance depends on unity, and Harry's independence made that unity impossible. When Charles finally acted, he wasn't just disciplining his son. He was preserving a 1,000-year-old institution that has survived wars, divorces, and revolutions. In the grand scale of royal history, personal pain has always been the price of continuity. And yet, even in his resolve, Charles is said to feel the ache of loss. Those who have spoken with him describe quiet moments of reflection. When the king retreats into solitude, his thoughts consumed by the son he can no longer reach. The corridors of Buckingham Palace may gleam with history, but they are filled with ghosts, memories of family dinners, childhood laughter, the bond once unbroken. Duty may have silenced love, but it has not erased it. The crown demands sacrifice, and for Charles, that sacrifice now bears his son's name. As this chapter closes, one truth becomes undeniable. The final straw was not about rebellion or reform. It was about two men trapped in roles neither fully chose, bound by love yet divided by legacy. The king has done what he believes necessary. The prince has chosen what he believes right. The result is not victory for either side, but an ending written in quiet heartbreak, a royal father's final act to defend his crown, even if it means losing his child forever. When the official announcement finally came, it did not arrive in the form of a royal decree or televised statement. Instead, it emerged through a series of quiet administrative changes, subtle but unmistakable. The palace website was updated, the court circular revised, and Harry's name began disappearing from lists and official references that once tethered him to his royal past. It was a digital erasure that spoke louder than any words. For those who understood the workings of the monarchy, the meaning was clear. Prince Harry's royal ties were no longer suspended. They were gone. To the public, the shift seemed sudden, but inside royal circles it had been carefully planned for months. The monarchy, by nature, does not act impulsively. Every move is deliberate, calculated, and symbolic. Harry's vanishing royal ties marked the final stage of a process that had been unfolding since 2020, when he and Meghan first stepped back from their duties. Back then, there was talk of a half-in, half-out arrangement, a modern compromise that would allow them to retain royal patronages while pursuing financial independence. But from the start, senior courtiers warned it would never work. The monarchy thrives on clarity, not compromise. You are either in or out. Loyalty is not a spectrum. It is a condition. As the months turned into years, Harry's connection to the institution grew weaker. His military appointments were the first to go, titles that had once defined his public identity as a soldier and veteran. The loss of his honorary ranks, particularly Captain General of the Royal Marines, was a devastating blow. It wasn't just about prestige. The military had been his refuge, the one environment where he felt purpose beyond the palace walls. To be stripped of those roles was to lose a part of himself that had nothing to do with the media or fame. Insiders recall that Charles agonized over that decision, knowing how much those affiliations meant to his son. But in the monarchy, emotional attachment cannot override structural order. The king's signature on that paperwork represented more than a reshuffle. It was the beginning of Harry's slow exile from royal identity. Next came the patronages. Dozens of charities and organizations that once had the words royal patron beside Harry's name began receiving quiet communications from the palace. They were informed that their association with the Duke of Sussex would no longer continue under royal endorsement. Some of these charities, particularly those tied to mental health and veteran support, had been deeply personal to Harry. For them, his departure felt like losing a champion. For the institution, it was about protecting brand integrity. The Crown does not share its platform with those who criticize it. Even the most compassionate causes could not bridge that divide. By 2023, Harry's relationship with the royal household had become almost entirely symbolic. He was still invited to major family events, coronations, funerals, state occasions, but always as an observer, never as a participant. At the late Queen's funeral, he wore a civilian suit while his brother and uncles donned military uniforms. The visual difference was jarring. It wasn't simply protocol, it was messaging. Every photograph told a story of separation. For a man born into uniformed ceremony, to stand in plain clothes beside his decorated relatives was a quiet humiliation. Yet, to his credit, he bore it with dignity, understanding that protest would only deepen the fracture. Even communication between Harry and the institution became strained. The palace operates on hierarchy, and once his formal roles were removed, so too were his channels of contact. Instead of direct correspondence, messages began flowing through intermediaries or lawyers. Invitations were extended with formality rather than familiarity. Where once he had a private secretary coordinating royal engagements, now he received notices like any other external figure. It was the monarchy's way of saying, "You are no longer one of us." The emotional toll of this vanishing act cannot be overstated. For Harry, each removed title and revoked patronage represented not just a professional demotion but a personal rejection. These were not mere decorations. They were symbols of belonging, proof that he was part of something larger than himself. To lose them was to lose identity. For Charles, however, it was a necessary act of containment. The king viewed each lingering tie as a vulnerability, a potential link through which the family's internal affairs could be exposed. The monarchy's survival depends on its ability to protect its internal world from external scrutiny. Harry's open, expressive nature, once celebrated for bringing warmth to the family image, had become a liability. The king's advisors saw the severance not as cruelty but as insulation. The public reaction reflected the deep divide between generations. Older Britons tended to view the decision as inevitable, an unfortunate but logical consequence of Harry's choices. The younger public, especially those more sympathetic to Meghan and Harry's perspective, saw it as punishment for honesty. To them, Harry was not rebelling against family but against a system built on secrecy and control. The palace, however, has never measured morality by public sympathy. In their world, appearances are everything, and deviation from protocol is indistinguishable from betrayal. Among the quietest yet most symbolic removals was the use of HRH, His Royal Highness. For centuries, that style denoted not just royal blood but active representation of the crown. When it was first withdrawn, Harry's team claimed he had voluntarily agreed not to use it. But the reality behind palace doors was more complex. The decision came from the top, reflecting the king's belief that titles without duty are meaningless. To the monarchy, privilege must be earned through service. To Harry, who had served in combat, that sentiment was bitterly ironic. He had risked his life for his country, yet now his royal identity was deemed unearned. Still, despite the symbolism, the king's move was not one of revenge. It was, by all accounts, deeply pragmatic. The institution had reached a point where Harry's independence was irreconcilable with its traditions. The crown cannot coexist with commercial autonomy. When Harry and Meghan launched their media ventures, deals with Netflix, Spotify, and various production companies. It blurred the line between personal profit and royal influence. The monarchy's code of neutrality demands distance from such endeavors. For Charles, allowing his son to operate under royal branding while building a private empire risked accusations of favoritism and exploitation. It was not malice that drove the decision, it was self-preservation. But the emotional narrative beneath these bureaucratic maneuvers was one of loss and loneliness. Every title removed, every connection erased, pushed Harry further into isolation from the world that had shaped him. Those close to him describe a man torn between two identities, one defined by heritage, the other by conviction. He believed stepping away would bring peace. Instead, it brought an endless reminder of what he had left behind. The privileges he once took for granted, the royal protection, the access, the status, were replaced by uncertainty. Even his security arrangements became points of contention, sparking legal battles over whether he should retain police protection during visits to the UK. In the eyes of the state, he was no longer entitled to it. The message was clear: you can't leave the crown and still claim its shield. Meanwhile, within the palace, Charles's demeanor grew more guarded. Those who met with him in private describe a man resigned to the consequences of leadership. He rarely speaks of Harry in public, but in private moments, his disappointment lingers. The removal of his son's remaining ties was not a decision of anger but of necessity. He had spent years hoping the storm would pass, that time and distance might heal what words could not. But monarchy is a system of symbols, and symbols cannot survive contradiction. A prince living outside the royal code is an unsustainable contradiction. And so, the king chose clarity over chaos, even at the cost of his own peace. The aftermath of this decision left a vacuum that no statement could fill. The palace offered no comment, following its time-honored tradition of silence. Yet that silence, paradoxically, became deafening. Royal watchers, analysts, and media outlets filled the void with speculation. Was this the king's final act of disownment? Or was it, in his mind, an act of tough love, a way to force Harry into a new phase of self-definition? Some insiders believe Charles sees this as a necessary rite of passage, a painful but inevitable transformation. Others think it marks the end of any realistic hope for reconciliation. In Montecito, the news reached Harry through the same digital channels as the rest of the world. Friends say he reacted not with surprise but with a weary acceptance. He had expected this for months, perhaps even years. Yet, knowing what's coming does not soften the blow. The finality of it, the realization that there was no longer any institutional bridge left between him and his family, was a wound that no public statement could hide. For Meghan, the event carried its own bittersweet weight. She had encouraged Harry to stand on his own, to live free of royal expectations. But watching the last traces of his heritage dissolve left even her uneasy. Freedom, after all, often comes at the cost of belonging. As the world digested the implications, one truth emerged with clarity. This was not just an administrative update, it was a royal verdict. The king had spoken not through words but through action. Harry's vanishing royal ties were more than symbolic. They were the visible manifestation of an invisible divide. What began as a rift had become a full separation. The monarchy, long known for its endurance, had once again chosen survival over sentiment. For the king, the crown must remain untarnished, even if it means standing alone. And yet, there remains an irony that history will not ignore. In stripping his son of royal ties, Charles may have freed him in ways he never intended. Without titles or obligations, Harry is now beyond palace control. He can speak freely, act independently, and live without the weight of royal restraint. But that freedom comes with a price: exile from the only life he has ever known. For the king, the loss of a son's loyalty may haunt him for years. For Harry, the loss of his identity may haunt him for a lifetime. Between them lies a silence that neither duty nor distance can bridge. The monarchy has always survived by pruning its branches, cutting away those that threaten the tree's stability. This time, however, the pruning was personal. The vanishing of Harry's royal ties marks not just the end of a chapter but the rewriting of an entire lineage. The crown continues, gleaming and unyielding, but one of its jewels now lies outside its circle, no longer shining for the institution, but for himself. Whether history will see this as a tragedy or a transformation remains to be seen. Inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, time moves differently. The world outside races through headlines and speculation, but within those ancient corridors, decisions unfold in deliberate silence. The palace is a fortress, not just of stone and marble, but of secrecy, tradition, and unspoken codes. Every door conceals history. Every whisper carries weight. And in these days following King Charles's final act against his youngest son, that weight has never been heavier. Those close to the inner workings of the royal household describe an atmosphere that feels both tense and resigned, as though everyone knows a line has been crossed that can never be redrawn. In the early mornings, the palace staff moves through the building with an uncharacteristic quiet. Gone are the days when the mention of Prince Harry would bring nervous glances or whispered debates among aides. Now his name is met with silence, not out of fear but finality. He has become the ghost of Buckingham Palace, present in memory, absent in mention. For those who have served the royal family for decades, this silence feels unnatural. They remember the young prince running through the corridors, his laughter echoing off the walls, Diana's gentle scolding voice trailing behind. They remember Charles, then still the Prince of Wales, watching his sons with pride. The same man now sits on the throne, burdened with the knowledge that duty has required him to erase one of those memories from the institution's living narrative. Inside the king's private study, the mood is somber but composed. Charles begins each day with his usual routine, a stack of briefing papers, correspondence, and the red boxes containing matters of state. But those who have observed him recently note subtle changes. His mornings last longer. He reads in silence for extended periods, often staring into the garden through the tall windows before signing documents. The expression on his face betrays the turmoil he tries to hide. He has made his decision as monarch, but as a father, the cost gnaws at him. The people closest to him, his private secretary, his communications director, and the queen consort, have learned not to mention Harry unless absolutely necessary. The king has not forbidden it, but the subject lingers like a wound that hasn't healed. In one recent conversation, a senior aide reportedly described the king as haunted by consequence. He knows that the world is watching, parsing every move he makes. To the public, this appears as a story about power and punishment. But within the palace, it's understood as something much deeper, an attempt to restore order. The monarchy has always survived by controlling its narrative, and Harry's continued defiance represented chaos. For Charles, who spent his entire life waiting for this role, stability is sacred. The challenge he faces now is preserving that stability without appearing heartless. It's a near impossible task, and one that weighs on him daily. Queen Camilla, ever pragmatic, has become his anchor through this storm. Those who know her describe a woman who understands the burden of royal decisions more than anyone else. She has lived through decades of public scorn and scrutiny, emerging with the resilience that only experience can teach. To her, this crisis is not just about family, it's about endurance. Behind closed doors, she is said to counsel the king with quiet firmness. "The crown must come first," she reportedly told him, echoing words that have guided monarchs for centuries. She doesn't speak those words without empathy. She speaks them as someone who has witnessed how sentiment can destroy a royal legacy. Her loyalty to Charles is absolute, and in moments of doubt, he turns to her not for comfort but for clarity. In contrast, other members of the family have taken their own positions. Prince William's stance is one of quiet agreement. Though he refrains from discussing his brother publicly, insiders say his patience has long since worn thin. The strain between the brothers, once described as unbreakable, has become a chasm. William sees the monarchy's future as his responsibility, and in his view, Harry's behavior undermines that future. He supports his father's decision not out of cruelty but conviction. He knows that when his own time comes, the example Charles sets now will define how the next generation of royals operates. Privately, William is said to believe that the monarchy cannot afford to indulge rebellion without consequence. For him, Harry's departure was necessary for the crown to survive intact. Not everyone inside the palace agrees. A few older courtiers, those who served under Queen Elizabeth, worry that Charles's decision marks a departure from her signature style of patience. The late Queen was famous for her ability to absorb scandal without retaliation, allowing time and silence to do the work that words could not. Charles, they argue, is too reactive, too human in his emotions. But others believe this is precisely why his reign is more modern, more transparent. Unlike his mother, Charles does not hide his feelings behind formality. He acts, not because he seeks to punish, but because he believes unresolved conflict corrodes trust. This division among the palace ranks has created an unusual dynamic: respect for the king's authority, mixed with quiet apprehension about its consequences. Within the communications office, the crisis has demanded careful choreography. The palace press team has mastered the art of saying nothing while conveying everything. Their strategy is deliberate. Avoid direct comment on the matter, but subtly shift the royal narrative toward continuity and unity. Recent public engagements have emphasized family, duty, and heritage. Images of Charles with William and Catherine, photographs of royal charity work, carefully timed media releases highlighting the king's initiatives. Every detail is designed to redirect attention away from the rift. The unspoken rule in royal communications is simple: never deny, never confirm, and never react emotionally. The institution speaks through action, not dialogue. But even among staff, emotion seeps through the surface. Many senior aides who worked closely with both princes privately admit that the situation has taken a toll. They describe moments of nostalgia when passing through the palace rooms where the boys once played. Harry's absence feels like a missing heartbeat. For decades, the monarchy presented an image of family unity, a rare blend of duty and affection. Now that illusion has fractured. Behind closed doors, even the most composed officials admit that morale has suffered. The palace has weathered scandals before: divorces, affairs, public criticism. But this feels different. This is not. The atmosphere within the king's household is mirrored at other royal residences. At Windsor, staff have noticed fewer visits from the king in recent months. He prefers the quiet of Highgrove or Sandringham, places where the weight of responsibility feels lighter. There, in the solitude of his gardens, he finds temporary peace. Gardening has always been his form of meditation, a private world where order can be restored with soil and pruning shears. But even in those serene moments, those who see him say his thoughts often drift. A gardener who has worked at Highgrove for years once described seeing the king pause mid-task, gaze into the distance, and sigh heavily before resuming his work. He looked, the gardener said, like a man pruning his heart. Inside the palace's administrative offices, the process of formally removing Harry's affiliations continues quietly. Every document, every change in protocol passes through multiple layers of approval. Nothing in the monarchy happens by accident. The decision to remove Harry's final titles is being implemented with surgical precision, meticulous, emotionless, and irreversible. The officials involved are not making judgments. They are executing orders. Yet, even they understand the gravity of what they're doing. One long-serving staff member, who has seen 3 generations of monarchs, reportedly said, "It's like erasing a chapter of the family album while the king watches." The courtiers who handle Charles's personal schedule now take extra care to avoid unnecessary stress. The king's days are structured to balance duty with reflection. Meetings with advisors are kept brief, engagements limited to essential functions. The queen consort ensures he rests, urging him to focus on state matters rather than emotional ones. Still, whispers persist that Charles has moments of private remorse. At night, he reportedly retreats to his private sitting room, where he listens to classical music or reads letters from past decades. Letters from Diana, notes from his sons when they were young. It's in these quiet hours, away from the crown and its demands, that the man behind the monarch emerges, a father mourning the living absence of his child. For palace insiders, This moment marks a turning point in royal history. They understand that the monarchy has faced crises before, but never one that so deeply reflects the clash between the personal and the institutional. Charles's decision to cut ties with Harry is seen not as an act of cruelty but of necessity, a reinforcement of the idea that monarchy and individuality cannot coexist without compromise. Within the palace walls, that principle is sacred. The crown exists because it stands above personal feelings. But the irony is painful. In order to preserve the monarchy's humanity in the public eye, Charles has had to act in a way that appears inhuman. Among the younger staffers, those who grew up watching Diana's compassion and Harry's charm, there's a quiet sadness. To them, this feels like the closing of an era. They had seen in Harry a reflection of a more open, emotional royal family, one that could bridge the gap between tradition and modernity. Now that vision seems lost. Some whisper that the king's firmness, while necessary, might have come too late. That if reconciliation had been pursued earlier, before the interviews, before the memoir, perhaps the outcome could have been different. But such speculation is dangerous within the palace. To question the king's decisions is to misunderstand the institution's core. Monarchy is not about emotion. It's about endurance. As days turn into weeks, the palace regains its rhythm. The ceremonies continue, the public appearances unfold as scheduled, and the business of monarchy resumes as if nothing has changed. But beneath that veneer of normalcy, something has shifted permanently. The staff may not speak of Harry, but his absence lingers. It is felt in the quiet corners, in the empty spaces of conversation, in the faint melancholy that hangs over royal gatherings. The walls of Buckingham Palace, built to contain history, now contain heartbreak. And yet, for all the sorrow that lies within, there is also acceptance. Those closest to the king know that he made this decision with full awareness of its cost. To him, leadership demands sacrifice, and no sacrifice is greater than family. Inside the palace walls, that truth has become both the burden and the justification of his reign. The father may grieve, but the monarch endures. The echoes of that endurance will define not just his legacy, but the future of the crown itself. For years, Meghan Markle's presence in Prince Harry's life has been viewed as both his liberation and his undoing, depending on who tells the story. To the public, she arrived like a spark, modern, eloquent, ambitious, and unapologetically confident. To the monarchy, she was a disruption to a centuries-old rhythm. And to King Charles, she became the shadow stretching between him and his youngest son, the invisible force that magnified every fracture in the royal family into a permanent divide. No matter how carefully the palace tries to control the narrative, every insider agrees on one thing. Nothing in the House of Windsor has been the same since Meghan entered the frame. It began with a sense of fascination. When Harry introduced Meghan to his family, there was a genuine curiosity about her. She was unlike anyone they had encountered before. A successful actress, an advocate for women's rights, a woman who carried herself not as a royal aspirant but as an equal partner. For Charles, this was intriguing. He admired confidence. He respected intellect. In private, he reportedly described her as a breath of fresh air. In those early days, he even seemed to welcome her influence, believing she might help his son find purpose beyond the confines of royal protocol. But the enthusiasm didn't last. The monarchy has always demanded conformity, and Meghan was not built for silent obedience. Inside the palace, her straightforward American manner clashed with the careful restraint that defines royal culture. To Meghan, authenticity meant speaking one's truth. To the monarchy, it meant guarding one's dignity through silence. Every interaction became a matter of interpretation. What Meghan viewed as self-expression was seen by courtiers as defiance. Her willingness to voice frustration, to question tradition, to challenge the unspoken rules. These qualities, admired in Hollywood, became sources of unease behind palace walls. The staff who had long operated under rigid hierarchy found her directness unsettling. Reports of tension, disagreements, and tears began to leak, each story fueling the growing narrative that Meghan was at odds with the firm. Harry's devotion to Meghan only deepened the divide. To him, she represented the freedom he had long craved, the ability to live on his own terms, unburdened by the rigid expectations that had shaped his every move since childhood. To the king, however, she represented disruption. Not because of who she was, but because of how her presence amplified Harry's rebellion. What had once been the quiet restlessness of a younger son became a public declaration of independence. Insiders claim that Charles initially believed the tension could be managed through patience and guidance. But as the situation escalated into a global media phenomenon, patience gave way to frustration. He had underestimated how powerful and how uncontrollable the combination of Harry and Meghan would become. The tipping point came with their decision to step down as senior royals. While the couple framed it as a mutual agreement with the palace, the truth behind closed doors was far less amicable. Meghan's insistence on financial independence and control over their public image clashed with the palace's protocols. She saw the royal system as restrictive, outdated, and, in her words, designed for survival, not happiness. For Charles, those words were devastating. To him, the monarchy had always been about sacrifice, the understanding that personal fulfillment must yield to public duty. Hearing his daughter-in-law describe that sacrifice as imprisonment cut at the very heart of his belief system. The conversation that followed between Charles, Harry, and Meghan reportedly ended in tears, frustration, and an unbridgeable silence. The king had offered compromise. Meghan wanted autonomy. There was no middle ground. From that moment, Meghan became the unspoken name within the palace corridors. When advisors discussed the royal rift, they rarely said Meghan aloud. They referred to her as the Duchess, a title that carried equal parts formality and distance. To them, she was no longer a family member but a symbol of everything the institution feared: modern influence, emotional transparency, and independence from royal control. Yet to Harry, she was his partner, his protector, the one person who truly understood his discontent. Every criticism of Meghan felt, to him, like an attack on the life he had chosen. The more the palace tried to contain the damage, the more Harry withdrew. What began as a family disagreement transformed into a power struggle between two worlds, tradition and individuality. Behind closed doors, Charles wrestled with the reality that he could not separate his feelings about his son from his views of Meghan. Those close to him say that he often expressed confusion rather than anger. "She's intelligent, she's capable," he reportedly said, "but she doesn't understand what this life requires." In his mind, Meghan's greatest offense was not her independence, but her unwillingness to adapt. Charles had spent his entire life learning to compromise his desires for the sake of the crown. He assumed others could do the same. But Meghan saw the crown not as an inheritance, but as a constraint. Her refusal to conform was, to Charles, a rejection of the values he held sacred. And through that lens, every decision she and Harry made felt personal. Camilla, meanwhile, had her own view. Having once been the target of public hatred, she understood better than anyone the cruelty of royal scrutiny. Yet, unlike Meghan, she never fought against it. She survived it through patience and discretion. To her, Meghan's approach, public vulnerability, emotional interviews, open confrontation, was a fatal mistake. "You cannot fight the system from within," she is said to have told a confidant. "It will always win." In Camilla's eyes, Meghan's attempt to modernize the royal narrative was doomed from the start. But she also recognized the deeper tragedy. Meghan and Harry genuinely believed they could redefine the monarchy through openness, not realizing that the monarchy's power lies precisely in its opacity. For Charles, the moment that solidified his view came during the televised interview that shook the world. When Meghan spoke of feeling isolated, unsupported, and mentally unwell within the royal system, the king reportedly watched in silence. But when she claimed that conversations had occurred about how dark her unborn child's skin might be, he is said to have turned pale. That accusation struck at the monarchy's very foundation. For an institution that survives on public perception, it was catastrophic. Regardless of who had made such remarks or whether they were misunderstood, the implication of racism within the royal family was devastating. To Charles, it wasn't just a family matter, it was a direct assault on the moral legitimacy of the crown. In the weeks that followed, the palace scrambled to contain the fallout, releasing a statement that would become iconic in its restraint. Recollections may vary. Behind those 3 words lay the king's fury, grief, and fear for the future of the institution he had just inherited. The damage, however, was irreversible. The palace's trust in Harry and Meghan evaporated completely. Every phone call became a potential headline. Every family gathering felt like a negotiation. Charles reportedly confided in close friends that he no longer knew who to trust. He still loved his son, but he no longer recognized him. And Meghan, intelligent, composed, and fiercely protective, had become, in his eyes, the architect of Harry's defiance. Whether fair or not, that belief hardened over time, shaping every subsequent decision. The king began to view reconciliation not as a matter of love, but of national security. As long as Meghan remained central in Harry's life, Charles believed the risk of renewed exposure or criticism would always linger. Within the palace staff, opinions about Meghan are divided. Some view her as a victim of institutional rigidity, a woman who dared to bring modern humanity into an antiquated system. Others see her as manipulative, using her influence to isolate Harry from his family. What both sides agree on is her impact. Even from thousands of miles away, Meghan's presence continues to influence royal decision-making. Every policy, every public engagement, every communication about Harry is filtered through the question: how will she react? The palace has learned the hard way that silence from Meghan is not peace. It is preparation. In Montecito, Meghan's perspective is equally layered. Those close to her describe a woman who feels both vindicated and wounded. She believed the palace underestimated her, that they never truly accepted her as part of the family. Her decision to speak out was, in her mind, an act of self-preservation, not rebellion. Yet, the relentless criticism that followed, from tabloids, commentators, even former staff, has left scars. She remains fiercely protective of her family, especially Harry, whom she sees as having suffered lifelong trauma under royal expectation. In private, she reportedly tells friends that she saved him from a system that would have destroyed him. To her, the rift is not tragedy, it is survival. But to Charles, the cost of that survival has been the disintegration of his family. Every time Meghan and Harry make a public appearance, the palace braces for the headlines. Every time they launch a new project or interview, advisors monitor its tone for potential criticism. The monarchy, for all its grandeur, now lives in quiet anticipation of the next revelation. Even moments of joy, like royal weddings or state celebrations, are shadowed by absence. There is always the empty chair, the unspoken question, the ghost of what could have been. Behind the king's calm exterior lies a simmering mixture of regret and pride. He knows he cannot undo what has been said or done, but he also knows that yielding to emotional reconciliation would signal weakness. The monarchy survives not by sentiment but by symbolism, and the symbol must remain unbroken. To reinstate Harry and Meghan in any form would be to admit that rebellion carries no cost. For Charles, that is unthinkable. And yet, when he looks at old family photographs, Diana with the boys in the gardens of Kensington, Harry laughing beside his father at polo, he feels the weight of what he has lost. In this unending conflict, Meghan stands as both scapegoat and symbol. To the monarchy, she represents change too rapid for an ancient system to absorb. To the public, she represents a challenge to power, a woman who refused to be silenced. To Harry, she represents love in its purest and most protective form. And to Charles, she represents the price of evolution, the truth that modernization, when it comes too quickly, can fracture the very institution it seeks to improve. As the sun sets over Buckingham Palace, the king's advisors gather in hushed tones to finalize his next engagements. The corridors are calm again, but the calm feels fragile, as though it could shatter with the next media headline. Somewhere in California, a very different scene unfolds. Sunlight over the Pacific, the laughter of 2 children, a couple planning their future free from royal protocol. 2 worlds, once intertwined, now live in opposition. One ruled by silence and structure, the other by voice and freedom. And in the middle of that invisible divide stands Meghan Markle, the shadow that neither side can escape, the woman who redefined what it means to marry into royalty and, in doing so, changed the monarchy forever. The words themselves were never meant for public ears, but in the quiet world of royal whispers, nothing stays hidden for long. "You're not a prince." The phrase, sharp as glass, was allegedly spoken during what insiders describe as one of the most emotionally charged exchanges between King Charles and his son since the day Harry walked away from royal life. It wasn't a threat, not even a punishment. It was a declaration, the verbal embodiment of everything that had already been decided behind palace walls. The monarchy doesn't speak in outbursts. It speaks in symbols. But this time, Charles's voice carried the weight of finality. And with those 4 words, a father's last thread of hope unraveled. For Harry, the words must have cut deeper than any official announcement ever could. He was born a prince, raised as one, defined by it in every sense. From the moment he took his first steps at Kensington Palace, the world had called him Prince Harry. It wasn't just a title, it was an identity, one that shaped how people saw him, how he saw himself. Even as he tried to carve out an independent life, that identity followed him everywhere, a shadow he could never escape. To hear his father, the king himself, strip that away, not through formal decree but through the rawness of speech, was to have his very existence questioned. It wasn't about losing privilege. It was about losing place. The conversation reportedly happened during a private phone call, not long after Harry's latest appearance drew media attention that embarrassed the palace. By then, Charles's patience had worn thin. The months of tension had stretched into years, and every attempt at diplomacy had collapsed into frustration. The king, normally measured in tone, was said to have spoken with a rare blend of sadness and resolve. "You've made your choice," he told his son. "You're not a prince anymore. You're my son, but you're not of this family in the way you once were." Those who know Charles well say that it was not said in anger, but in grief. The monarchy, for all its grandeur, is built on unyielding rules. A prince without duty, without allegiance, is a contradiction. And in Charles's mind, contradictions are dangerous. His words were not just paternal disappointment. They were an acknowledgement of reality. The crown could not carry a name that no longer stood for service. But to Harry, the phrase sounded like exile, as though the blood that tied him to his father meant nothing in the face of duty. The echo of that statement spread quickly among royal aides, who understood its deeper implication. It wasn't an official change in status that had already been done quietly through documentation. It was emotional closure. The king had spoken the words that no bureaucratic process could express. From that moment forward, the distance between father and son ceased to be political and became personal. Insiders say that in the days following that conversation, Charles appeared composed in public, attending meetings and smiling for the cameras. But those who saw him in private described him as withdrawn, contemplative, as though he had finally accepted something he had resisted for years. That reconciliation might never come.